November 8th, 1944. The remote eastern edge of France's Lorraine region. The ground stank of rain-soaked mud, burnt powder, and diesel leaking from overworked engines. A heavy dawn fog lay over the landscape like a burial cloth, suffocating sound and light alike. Then from deep within that pale curtain came a noise powerful enough to change the destiny of armored war. A low, brutal growl as dozens of Sherman tanks rumbled awake, shaking the cold soil beneath them. The deep, throaty ignition of 30 Sherman tanks coming alive at once. Each one crewed by men the USS Army had labeled unfit to command, unfit to fight, and certainly unfit to win. The 761st Tank Battalion, an all-black armored unit, was minutes from carving its name into history. History, however, had no intention of remembering them. These men had crossed an ocean that didn't want them, traveled 3,000 kilometers toward a war that doubted their worth, and spent 2 grueling years training in a nation that wouldn't even serve them a cup of coffee. Now sealed inside their steel beast, waiting for the signal to advance. They carried a burden heavier than any 75mm round packed into their racks. They carried the weight of an official Army doctrine, a 1925 study that confidently declared black soldiers mentally unfit for real combat. According to this report, black troops lacked the intelligence for battlefield decisions, panicked easily under fire, and possessed a so-called natural cowardice that made them useless in offensive roles. This wasn't rumor. This was U.S. Army policy, printed, circulated, and taught at West Point. The 761st knew all of it. They'd read the statements. They'd heard the insults. They'd faced the sneers of white officers who inspected them at Camp Claiborne in Louisiana, the same place that had hammered them for 2 years into something the Army claimed could not exist. They were ready to prove that the only thing the 1225 study got correct was the year. Everything else was a lie, and the correction would be written in mud, blood, and shattered German armor across 6 nations and 183 straight days of combat. But before we drop into the fight with them, I want to know who's standing in formation with us today. We're building a community of people who know real history isn't the polished version found in schoolbooks. So do me one thing. Jump down to the comments and call out your city and state. Let me see where the Patriots are posted today. Post your location and let's move forward into this story together. Imagine America in 1940. The country was still crawling out of the Great Depression. Europe was ablaze beneath the iron heel of the German war machine. President Franklin Roosevelt read the British and French intelligence cables and knew the truth. Whether America wanted the fight or not, war was coming. The U.S. military began to swell with new recruits, hundreds of thousands of them, but segregation ruled everything. The Selective Service Act allowed black men to be drafted, but it also cemented racial separation in every unit. The Army defended this with claims of morale and efficiency, insisting white soldiers would never fight well beside black troops. So black Americans were pushed into labor roles, digging trenches, unloading ships, driving supply trucks, burying the dead. The front line off limits and armor tanks absolutely forbidden. Tanks were the kings of modern battle. Fast, deadly, requiring coordination and quick decision-making that the Army insisted black men were incapable of. To place a black tanker inside a Sherman in the minds of many generals was to cheapen the symbol of American power. But total war has a way of crushing prejudice under sheer necessity. By 1942, the Army had a crisis. It desperately needed armored battalions. Germany had already shown in France and North Africa that tanks could decide entire campaigns. With Europe looming, the U.S. needed thousands of trained tank crews, and the pool of white volunteers was drying up. So the War Department had to face an uncomfortable truth. If America wanted to win, it would have to arm the men it feared. The creation of the 761st Tank Battalion wasn't progress. It was desperation wrapped in the language of experiment. Train one all-black tank battalion, send them into combat, and see what happens. If they succeeded, good, more manpower. If they failed, the 1925 study could be waved around as proof that black men had no place in combat. The men of the 761st knew exactly what the stakes were. They knew the game was rigged. They knew the Army wanted to be proven right. And still they volunteered because their fathers and grandfathers had been trying to prove one simple thing since the Civil War. That they were men, soldiers, warriors, and no institution would define their worth. Activated on April 1st, 1942 at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana. The battalion began its training in the segregated Deep South. The irony was brutal. They were preparing to defend a democracy in a state where they couldn't vote, learning the most advanced machinery in the Army while being denied a seat at a lunch counter. The training was merciless, not just because tank warfare was technically demanding, but because the bar for them was perfection. A white unit could be adequate. A black unit had to be flawless. Any slip, any miscalculation, any imperfect move would be held up as evidence of inferiority. Instead, the pressure turned them into something exceptional. They came from every version of black America. sharecrowers from Mississippi, factorymen from Detroit with machine grease in their veins, Howard students fluent in multiple languages, jazz musicians, boxers, dreamers, laborers, all shaped by a lifetime of being told they were less. The Army expected disorder. What it got was brotherhood. Their commanding officer, Lieutenant Cole Paul Bates, a white officer, was different from most. Not a saint, but a soldier to his core. He didn't care about skin color. He cared whether his men could punch a shell through a German tank at 500 wide. He pushed them relentlessly, demanding excellence in gunnery, maintenance, discipline, communication, maneuver, and they delivered performances that shocked every inspector sent to judge them. They learned tank warfare inside out, the driver reacting to terrain instantly, the gunner calculating speed and distance in seconds, the loader absorbing the recoil of every shot, the commander juggling decisions, radio traffic, and survival, all inside a steel furnace filled with fuel, explosives, and fear. The Army said black men couldn't master it. The 761st proved otherwise in every drill, but their greatest challenge wasn't technical, it was psychological. By day they were armored warriors. By night they returned to segregated barracks, segregated mess halls, and towns where wearing a U.S. uniform didn't protect them from racist police or mob violence. They were preparing to die for a country that still treated them as subhuman. The contradiction carved a cold, focused fury inside them, and they poured that fury into their training. By summer 1944, they had mastered the M4 Sherman, a reliable workhorse, even if it lagged behind the deadly German Panthers and Tigers. They painted a leaping Black Panther on their turrets and chose a motto that said everything. They'd been ready for months, but the Army kept them stateside while white tank units shipped out. And the men began to suspect they'd never see battle, that the experiment was designed to fail through inaction. Then June 1st, 1944 changed everything. Normandy was a success, but the hedge turned France into a slaughterhouse for American armor. Casualties skyrocketed. The German defense was vicious. By August, with the Allies breaking out of Normandy, command was desperate for fresh tank units. The order finally came. The 761st was going to war. They reached England in September 1944, and the experience stunned them. The British, hardened by 4 years under bombardment, didn't care about the color of a man's skin. They cared whether he stood ready to fight tyranny. For the first time, the tankers of the 761st walked through a city in uniform, and were treated with simple human respect. British women danced with them in local halls. Brief moments where they were treated like human beings, not problems. That glimpse of dignity made returning to the rigid racial order of the USS Army even harsher. White American officers and MPs stationed in England were enraged to see black soldiers being treated as equals and cracked down violently to enforce segregation, shocking the British civilians who witnessed it. The message was unmistakable. The 761st might be preparing to fight Hitler, but in their own army they were still treated as second-ass. On October 10th, 1944, the 761st finally reached France. 4 months after D-Day, they rolled their Shermans onto Omaha Beach, now a massive supply zone, still scarred by wrecked landing craft and cratered cliffs. The men said little as they crossed the sand. They were finally entering the war they had trained years for. But white troops greeted them with cold stars, whispers, and hostility. Seeing the Black Panther insignia, white soldiers joked that the battalion must be a transport unit, or that the tanks would be driven by mechanics. The racism was casual, automatic, and ingrained. The 761st answered with silence and kept driving. They knew only their performance in combat could silence doubters. Assigned to Patton's Third Army, they were commanded by a general who was both a brilliant tactician and a product of old Army prejudice. When inspecting the 761st before their first mission, Patton told them everyone was watching, waiting to see if black soldiers could fight. He insisted he didn't care about color, only that they killed Germans, but then added that they'd need to prove him right. It was a compliment wrapped in skepticism. Something the men had heard all their lives. They didn't need his approval, only orders. Those came on November 8th, 1944. Their first assignment, support the 26th Infantry Division through dense forests and fortified towns in eastern France. The terrain was a nightmare, thick woods, narrow, muddy roads, and villages turned into strong points. This was not fast, sweeping armor warfare. It was close-quarters death where every tree-ine hid an anti-tank gun. Their baptism by fire came near Moenwich, where German forces armed with machine guns, mortars, and deadly 88 seconds had already repelled 2 white infantry attacks. The 761st was ordered to break through. At dawn, Sherman engines roared as they advanced in line, firing H rounds into German positions. The Germans responded immediately. The 88 seconds found their mark, turning the first Sherman into a burning wreck. Its crew bailed out, covered in soot, but the rest pushed forward, maneuvering, firing, and applying every tactic they had drilled for 2 years. Inspired, the infantry surged behind them, and together they overran the defenses. It was their first victory, but it cost 3 tanks and 11 men. The survivors climbed out of their machines and stared at the burning hulks of their friends' vehicles. No cheers, just the grim understanding that this was only the beginning. The 761st fought for 183 straight days. No rotation, no rest, no relief. In a war where Sherman tanks survived for weeks and tanker life expectancy could be measured in days, this was unheard of. White armored units were routinely pulled off the line. The 761st never was. They fought through France, the Ardennes, the Siegfried Line, and into Germany. 6 countries, 30 captured towns, and thousands of German casualties, all while carrying the burden of representing their entire race in an institution desperate to see them fail. Making things worse, the Germans quickly realized the propaganda value of crushing an all-black tank battalion. Whenever the 761st was identified on the field, elite German units hit them with overwhelming force. The irony was brutal. The 761st had to prove their equality to an American army that doubted them while simultaneously fighting an enemy whose racial ideology was even more extreme. Through all this, one object symbolized their experience: letters from home while surviving unimaginable battles that would have earned white units presidential citations. These men opened mail describing the Jim Crow laws their families endured: lynchings, segregated schools, blocked job applications, denied neighborhoods. They folded those letters, stuck them in their pockets, and climbed back into their tanks to fight for a country that denied their families basic dignity. Those letters forced them to confront a painful question. What exactly were they fighting for? The official answer, democracy, did not apply to them. And yet they pressed on, fighting not for the America that existed, but for the America that might one day exist. The Battle of the Bulge cemented their legacy. When Germany launched its desperate winter offensive, chaos swept through the American lines. The 761st, already exhausted, was thrown in without pause. Their mission: hold the critical road junction near Tillet, Belgium, a linchpin of the Allies' southern flank. In temperatures 20 the grind below zero, without proper winter gear because quartermasters deprioritized black units, the tankers battled frostbite, fumes, and exhaustion. They slept in running tanks to keep the engines from freezing. For 6 days they held off repeated German assaults, infantry, and armor, despite being outnumbered and losing over half their remaining tanks. Their casualty rate soared above 60%, but they never broke. Holding that junction helped blunt the German offensive and set the stage for Allied victory. They met every requirement for a presidential unit citation. They didn't receive it. The official explanation was that the action did not meet the standard. The real reason: the Army was unwilling to publicly acknowledge that a black unit had been decisive in one of the war's most critical battles. Individuals received medals, Bronze Stars, Silver Stars, but the unit itself was denied its due. Still, they pressed on. They fought through the Ruhr, crossed the Rhine, and pushed into Austria. They were among the first Americans to reach the Danube, and among the first to liberate a Nazi concentration camp. Hardened men broke down at the sight of starving prisoners and mass graves. In that moment, they understood that they weren't just fighting for respect. They were fighting against the very ideology that had shaped the racism they endured at home. When the war ended, they had one of the most impressive combat records of any armored battalion: 391 individual decorations, hundreds of destroyed enemy vehicles, thousands of prisoners, and unwavering performance under fire. They proved the racist 1,125 Army report claiming black soldiers were unfit for combat was a lie. But when they returned home, the celebration was for others. Jim Crow awaited them. Denied the vote, denied homes, denied GI Bill benefits through discriminatory systems, banned from restaurants, schools, and neighborhoods. They had fought fascism abroad only to face its American cousin at home. Many struggled with what we would now call PTSD nightmares, anger, alcoholism. But many became pillars of the civil rights movement, applying their military discipline to voter drives, boycotts, and community defense. For decades, their story was ignored in official histories, not out of hatred, but from an institutional desire to avoid challenging the racial status quo. But truth has a way of surfacing. In the 1,272 seconds, historians reopened the records. They found overwhelming evidence of the battalion's excellence. In 1978, 3 years late, the 761st finally received its presidential unit citation. Old men bowed but proud, stood in formation at the White House, and wept. Recognition had come but too late for many. In 1997, Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers, killed in heroic action in 1944, finally received the Medal of Honor. His nomination had been downgraded at the time for one unspoken reason. The Army was not ready to give its highest award to a black man. The deeper truth about the 761st runs far beyond medals, battle maps, or after-action reports. These men weren't just fighting Germans. They were fighting for the very definition of America, for who counted, for who belonged, for who had the right to wear the uniform and call themselves a defender of the nation. Their presence on the battlefield forced the United States to look in the mirror and confront its own contradictions. A country preaching freedom abroad while denying dignity at home. A nation claiming to fight tyranny while enforcing its own version of it in its barracks, buses, and ballot boxes. And yet the men of the 761st never broke. Their courage smashed the myth of racial inferiority that military me's and official studies had tried to cement as fact. Their relentless performance didn't just win battles, it cornered the U.S. Army into a truth it could no longer ignore. Segregation wasn't just immoral, it was militarily disastrous. They didn't fight for applause or headlines, they fought for vindication, for proof that bravery is not bound by skin, and that excellence cannot be kept behind a fence forever. The Army tried to forget them, to bury their story under paperwork and silence, but the 761st refused to fade. They carved their legacy into the steel of their Shermans, the mud of France, and the memory of every man who watched them charge into fire without hesitation. And today their influence lives everywhere. In museums, in military classrooms, in the integrated units that stand on their shoulders, and in the opportunities later generations of black soldiers inherited because the Panthers refused to accept the limits placed on them. In truth, the 761st fought not one war, but two. One against Hitler's armored divisions and one against America's own deeply rooted prejudice, and in the slow bend of history they won them both. But here's the part most people never hear. Their greatest battle didn't end in 1945. It continued in the years that followed in the struggle for recognition, for justice, and for the America they believed could exist. And the question we're left with today is this. If men who were denied equality could fight with such courage for the idea of America, what does that demand from the rest of us? Because the story of the 761st isn't finished.